I'm Dave Brandt. I'm the Executive Director of the National Law Enforcement Museum, and I want to welcome everyone tonight. I think we're going to have a great discussion and a really timely conversations tonight. I want to welcome all of you, and I also want to welcome the viewers and listeners who will be joining us on Facebook Live. Speaking of the museum, for those of you who haven't tracked the progress over the last decade or so, I'm thrilled to let you know that about a year from today, give or take a few days, we're excited about the opening of our National Law Enforcement Museum. For those of you who haven't tracked it closely, to give you a little sneak preview, it's going to be a phenomenal facility, 57,000 or so square feet, right across the street from the Memorial Wall, 3 stories underground, uniquely constructed to allow for all visitors just a fascinating and unique experience.
Dave, thank you, sir. Appreciate it very much. We are going to let Commissioner Bratton speak in a minute, but I did want to share a little bit of his biography, and it's going to take a moment or two. 1965, he served in the U.S. Army's Military Police Corps. 1970, sworn in as a patrol officer with the Boston Police Department. 1980, promoted to executive superintendent of the Boston Police Department, the youngest person ever to hold this leadership position. 1983, became chief of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority Police. 1990, appointed chief of the New York City Transit Police. 1993, appointed commissioner of the Boston Police Department. 1994, appointed commissioner of the New York City Police Department by Mayor Giuliani. 2002, appointed chief of the Los Angeles Police Department. 2011, appointed vice chair of the Homeland Security Advisory Council by President Obama. In 2014, appointed commissioner of the New York City Police Department for a second time by Mayor Bill de Blasio. Last year, Commissioner Bratton resigned as the commissioner of the New York City Police Department. He's now working in the private sector, heading up the risk management division of the global advisory firm Teneo Holdings. Everywhere he went, crime dropped dramatically. And throughout his career, he launched historic initiatives that have literally shaped the way we view law enforcement today. And it's our great honor, Commissioner, to have you with us and to share a little bit of your story, a story of American law enforcement, the type of story we want to tell so much of as part of this National Law Enforcement Museum that we're building, and you certainly are an important part of law enforcement's history. Let's start with the beginning. Going back to 1965, as I understand it, joining the U.S. Army and then being part of their military police corps. What motivated you to go into law enforcement?
Okay. Craig, before that, answering that question, thank all of you for being here this evening. I am Bill Bratton. I used to be somebody. And happy to be here with you this evening, that you take time at the end of your very busy days to talk about the profession that I love so much, and that Craig and his colleagues for these last 10 to 12 years have been so fervently working to make a reality. The celebration of the history of American policing. And it is a history that needs to be celebrated because we have come a long way. And when Craig first got started, I was chief of the LAPD and ended up once again for police commissioner for the second time. And once again, I'm back in the private sector again. It's been that long a journey. In terms of my journey, it's been an almost 50-year journey. I joined the U.S. Army in November 30th, 1966. 18 years of age, couldn't become a cop, lifelong dream till I was 21. The draft was in place. By signing up for 1 additional year, for 3 years, I could get my choice of classification, which in my case was military police. I could envision myself with that white hat and the brassard that said MP and the shiny boots, and that I, for 3 years, could be a military police officer. Didn't quite turn out that way. That my graduating class out of MP School, Fort Jordan, Ford, Georgia. All 400 of us were assigned as sentry dog handlers. That at that time, the Vietnam War, sentry dogs were used to guard many of the facilities and bases in Vietnam. And so for the next year, that's exactly what I did. I was there during the Tet Offensive, that historical attack that changed the course of that war. And then in 1969, came out of the Army after 3 years, took the police exam for the Boston Police Department, lifelong dream, passed fortunately, and in October 7th, one day after my 23rd birthday, began my police career.
Nobody could have imagined the type of career you ultimately had over some 35 years of law enforcement. But I have to wonder, at the beginning, did you ever imagine that law enforcement leadership, being the top cop, if you will, in a department, was that a dream of yours? Was that something you aspired to?
I think all my life I always was a leader of sorts. I really hated being told what to do, so I'd much prefer telling others what to do. And so coming into the Boston Police Department, that it was really just to be a cop, to have that experience. But very quickly, the frustrations I experienced with the leadership of that department really was a motivation for me to want to move up in that organization, although I came very close to leaving it, because the department at that time, like unfortunately so many in America, was very corrupt, very brutal, not professional at all, a lot of racism, which was so much a part of our country's history at that time, the 60s and 70s. And the motivation to move up quickly in the Boston Police Department was inspired literally by the poor leadership that I was reporting to. And I was very fortunate that a game changer came into the Boston Police Department in 1972, Robert DeGrazia, a personal role model for me, tall, handsome Italian guy, 6'2", coming out of Kansas City, brought in to deal with the corruption and the inefficiency and incompetence by a mayor who was aspiring to become vice president, if not president of the United States. It's amazing how things change when somebody has political aspirations, that he needed to have a department that was not one of the worst in America, one of the best. DeGrazia, for me, showed me how much one person could do in creating change. Within a very short period of time, he turned that department upside down. An opportunity for myself as a young police officer to serve on committees that were involved in reorganizing, re-engineering the department, a term I came to use. And the most significant thing that he did that changed the course of my life, and in some respects maybe changed the course of American policing over the next 40 years in terms of whatever influence I have brought into this profession. He changed the civil service examination for sergeant. The average age of a sergeant in the Boston Police Department at that time was in the 50s. The average age of a police officer, or a patrolman as we were called, there were no women, was in the 40s. And so as a young 26, 27-year-old taking that sergeant's exam after only 4 years on the job, I came in number 1 on that examination. And I was the youngest sergeant ever promoted in the history of the department. Our promotion was very different in that the books we had to study were whiz in hand, iron on supervision, management of police, the Kerner report on all the issues of the racial situation in America in the 1960s. So profoundly influenced and changed our profession for the next 20 years, some for the better, some for the worse, and we're still dealing with some of the legacies of that report. And the American Bar Association report on race in America. So rather than just studying the law and the Blue Book police procedures, we were looking at society and all of the issues in society. And that was a career changer for me. One, moving very quickly into the supervisory rank, but being exposed to a mentor who showed me the difference that one man, one woman, a leader can actually make in an organization. And the profound changes he made in that department, many of them are still in place 40 years later.
1993, you're given the top job in Boston, Commissioner of the Boston Police Department. Less than a year later, 1994, you're offered the top job in New York City, and you make the move. It's
It's my understanding that you might have turned down Mayor Giuliani more than once before you finally agreed to do it. I'm just curious as to what your thinking was then. Why make the move to New York, and why your hesitancy?
1993, I had been the chief of the New York City Transit Police Department, 1990-91. I had left Boston to take that job with the hope that possibly, and this might have seemed naive at the time, but this was the hope, that if I was successful in that 4,000-person organization separate from the NYPD police in the subways, that I might get noticed. And I was pretty good in my career getting noticed. I'd be the kid in class who would always raise his hand. I was pretty comfortable with the media, understood the importance of the media to tell your story. And so I was always very comfortable with them in the give and take. And New York, going into the transit police, it was the idea of doing an off-Broadway production, that if I could have a hit off-Broadway in the transit police, I'd get noticed enough that maybe I could make the unparalleled and historical leap from that to police commissioner in New York City. The idea of a kid from Boston heading up the NYPD was pretty far-fetched at that time. Good news for me, working with a couple of mentors, Bob Wasserman and George Kelling, co-author of Broken Windows, who had recruited me. They were consulting with the Transit Authority at that time. Transit system was a mess. Subways were a mess. New York was a mess. It was awful. Worst crime year in the history of the city of New York was 1990. 2,245 murders, over 5,000 people shot, over 500,000 Part 1 crimes. And that was on the streets. Subways, in many respects, were worse. Graffiti-covered trains, 5,000 homeless living in the subway on the platforms. It was a mess. And in 2 years, that was my most satisfying police experience in 40 some odd years. That police department, we were able to turn it around to such an extent it became the Marine Corps of New York City Police Department, housing police, transit, city police. And the ability to use leadership, the ability to inspire a demoralized workforce to engage in re-engineering, reinventing itself, paid off. It was the most satisfying for me because their morale was the worst I've ever seen. And within 2 years, their pride was just such that New York cops would be stopping them to talk about their new equipment, their new cars, that the things that were happening for them. And it was very satisfying. But 92, I went back to New York. That my wife had not come down with me at the time, and financially was running me into the ground, maintaining 2 homes. And I purposely went back to Boston because Boston was in the midst of a major crisis at that time, in which it looked like the mayor of Boston was going to be forced to remove the then police commissioner because of a major series of scandals. So I'm always somebody that's always looking for an opportunity, and went back to Boston with the hope and expectation that I might be able to parlay it into becoming police commissioner of the department that I had originally joined in 1970. And took me a little longer than anticipated, that the mayor was a little closer to the current commissioner than I thought he was. But in 1993, as Mayor Ray Flynn was leaving to become ambassador to the Vatican, the commissioner decided he was going to run for mayor, and got 1% of the vote and did not get elected mayor. But I was appointed police commissioner. And so the first of my dreams coming true, the idea of being police commissioner of the city of Boston. Thought that was going to be the capstone of my career. Around that time, Mayor Giuliani had just been elected to office in New York, was putting his team together. He and George Kelling and I had met with Giuliani in his run-up to the office, and he wanted to understand why crime had gone down so much in the subway, by 25 or 30% my first year there, whereas in the city it had only gone down by 1%. And I explained in terms of my beliefs about what's effective in policing. It resonated with him. So when he was elected mayor, that he offered me the position. I'm police commissioner of Boston. Lifelong dream, home up there, 1 year shy of a pension, and So there were a lot of issues, and I took 2 trips. The first trip I took, I turned around at the airport because the press was waiting in New York, and I didn't want, so it was supposed to be a secret meeting, was not quite so secret. There are no secrets in New York. Second trip, he urged me to come down. I went down with a very good friend, Bob Johnson, and my wife, and we drove down. Met a couple of mayor's aides up in Scarsdale, did the pre-interview, and then they drove me into the 10 o'clock meeting with Rudy Giuliani, where he offered me the job. Then they smuggled me into a hotel that night. My wife and I kept us under wraps, and then the next morning announced that I would be his next police commissioner. And it was at that time, some of you have read the book, that my comment at that first press conference announcing my appointment was that we would fight for every house, we would fight for every block, we would fight for every neighborhood, we would fight for the city, and we would win. Pretty bold prediction in a city that was still experiencing over 2,000 homicides a year. But we did win. And for 27 years, crime has gone down every year in New York City. And this year, it will go down another 25% in homicides and shootings, to the extent that 2,243 murders, 1990. This year, they'll have about 275. 5,000 people shot in 1990. This year, for the first time, fewer than 1,000. 500,000 Part 1 crimes in 1990. This year, for the first time ever in history, in a city that now has 1 million more people than it did in 1990, it'll have fewer than 100,000 reported Part 1 crimes. So it's a pretty good arc, 27 years of straight crime decline.
I love it. Now, last question about your career moves. You stepped down as police commissioner in New York City last year after less than 3 years on the job.
I have a hard time keeping a job.
Had a pretty good resume. But the question is, why did you decide to leave when you did? Obviously, you were being extremely successful, crime's way down, you were doing the job that you loved doing, and yet you walked away from it and you said you would never lead another department ever again.
Let me take you back 20 years, again, back to '94. In taking the commissioner's job the first time, I was so close to getting it and almost backed away from it with the idea that I was 1 year away from a pension. So taking the police commissioner's job in Boston or New York meant I was going to lose that pension that I had worked many years to get. And at age 46, you only have so many years to work. So that was a major issue. But I was at the White House at a meeting with President Clinton on the crime bill. And coming out, the media had been following me back and forth from New York to Boston and then down to Washington. And it was that day that I had made the decision that I wanted the job. And my fate was sealed because I got a question from one of the reporters on the front lawn of the White House that, what if Mayor Giuliani doesn't appoint you? And I said, well, Boston's a pretty good consolation prize. Well, needless to say, that didn't go over too well with the newly elected mayor in Boston, Mayor Menino, who couldn't wait to get rid of me. So my fate was sealed. So that was Giuliani. We survived for 27 months together, and that marriage ended up in a very bitter divorce. But we had produced a very significant child, if you would, and that was the safer New York City. The crime went down by almost 40% in the 27 months I was there. Unheard of, largest crime decline in that city's history. And now the city crime down is down by over 80% overall, largest crime decline of any city in the country. But we had our falling out. I went back to the private sector. Then in 2002, after 9/11, living in New York at the time of 9/11, I had just voted that morning, the morning of 9/11. The city was holding an election. I anticipated that the lead candidate was going to be elected mayor, and I was going back as police commissioner for unfinished business, because I was unfinished business. We had done so much, but there was more to do. 9/11 happened. Mark Green loses to Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg, for the next 12 years as mayor. He appoints Ray Kelly as his police commissioner. 2002, the position opens in LA. I compete for it, get that position, and end up as chief of the LAPD. The irony of that is that there were 4 positions that I had looked at as I matured in policing that are the 4 most iconic police departments in the world. New York, Los Angeles, Boston, in terms of being just about the oldest police department in the country, 1630, and London, Metropolitan Police. And I came very close in 2011 or 12 to being named head of the Metropolitan Police in London, but I was not a British citizen at that time. You had to be, so that didn't happen. But coming back up to take you back into 2014, coming back into policing and why I left after 3 years, the game plan was to come back in for 3 years with de Blasio, the new mayor, to finish the unfinished business of 1994, as well as to deal with the incredible issues of race, the issue of stop, question, and frisk, that so much of the turmoil that was churning in the country at that time. And the belief that I had ideas and had people I could surround myself with and had a mayor who I could work with, that we could impact on the churning situation of stop, question, and frisk, the racial divide that it was creating in New York in 2013. This was before Ferguson. This was before Ghana that happened on my watch. And I was an advisor to de Blasio in his run-up for election. So when he's elected in 2013, he asked me to be his commissioner. And the game plan was to only do 3 years, because I felt it would only take 3 years to accomplish everything that I wanted to do in that organization. And I'm pretty good on the prediction side of things, and it took us 3 years. And it was widely thought that he was going to come in progressive mayor after the 12 years of Ray Kelly and Mike Bloomberg and the continued crime decline during that period. But he was not a very popular mayor. He was elected with a very small percentage of the electorate. And to his great satisfaction, he's running for re-election this year, and he's able to show that his 4 years, crime went down every year again against predictions. I feel very good that I and the team that I surrounded myself with, we were able to deliver those 4 years for him with his very strong support. So this time it was a really conscious effort to leave the NYPD. 1996, it was reluctantly that I left.
Yeah. Good record. I think Mayor de Blasio will benefit from that.
Nice arc of history, arch of history, if you will. That I came in 1970, the turbulence of the 60s, left in 2016 with still turbulent waters, but policing is always going to be dealing with turbulence because it's what we do. It's, we are on the front line of whatever the societal issues of the day are. And the societal issues, Craig, as you'll see, and as you put the history of policing together, in '94, when I was Commissioner of New York, the issues were crime and disorder and the undercurrent of race. And race has always been the undercurrent in American policing and still is. But think of where we are in American policing today, what American police chiefs, police forces have to deal with in the 21st century. Crime is still there. Disorder is still there. The issue of race is even more prominent now than it was back then. But now we have to deal with cybercrime. We have to deal with terrorism. We have to deal with the emotionally disturbed that make up 40% of our prison populations. We have to deal with a huge increase in the homeless population living in our streets. We have to deal with the technologies of the world today. The rising threat of drones, for example, is just one example of a technology that we still don't know, both the good and bad of it. We have to deal with social media. Just think of all the various crimes that arise out of social media, that in terms of the widespread awareness now of pedophilia and sexual assaults and pornography, whatever, that it is an incredibly difficult world to try to navigate. So challenges of police chiefs in the 21st century are phenomenally different and expanded from what they were in the 1990s. Good news is that American policing, as your history will show in the museum, has come a long way, and particularly in these last 50 years that I was privileged to be part of it, to help lead some of it, and to help identify some of the great talent that's out there in American policing today.
Let's talk about an issue that's fresh on the minds of all of us. I know you've been spending a lot of time today talking about it with the media and others. Yesterday, New York City. And this is an interesting commentary I heard on the radio coming in today. The radio analyst said he refused to call this act an act of terrorist. He said it was the act of a cowardly murderer. And I don't like to use the term lone wolf. It gives them some sense of respect. Similarly, we call them terrorists, and they seem to think they're part of something that's more powerful than they are. The question is this, though. Whether you call them a terrorist, a lone wolf, or a cowardly murderer, this person yesterday took 8 lives. 11 others were seriously injured. He drove a rental truck down a bike path. And that, to us, is an act of terror. He did express his allegiance to the Islamic State. Question is, how were you so successful at combating those types of acts in New York City? And really, throughout this country, we've been pretty successful. Since 9/11, there have been roughly 90 Islamist, extremist, terrorist plots here in this country on U.S. soil. And yet more than 80% of them have been foiled before they ever occurred. How do we react to what happened yesterday, and what can we do to prevent such acts moving forward?
Put it into perspective, almost a third of the attacks that have been initiated since 9/11 have been directed against one city. That's New York. New York is still, for the terrorist world that's out there today, whether it's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, is the #1 target in which to achieve their goals of attacking successfully. And good news is that the NYPD, as reformed by Ray Kelly, my predecessor, immediately after 9/11, his mayor, that Ray recognized deficiencies that had helped to bring about the second World Trade Center attack. The first occurred during his first tour of duty as commissioner in 1993. Some loss of life, 6 lives lost, others injured. But after making the arrest of that terrorist group, they thought it was over. And policing went back, by and large, to dealing with crime and disorder. During my 2 years immediately following that first World Trade Center bombing, I don't think I spent 1% of my time on terrorist-related issues. It was all about crime and disorder. 2014, going back, I probably spent easily 40% of my time on that one issue, because it was that significant in that city, in our country, and in the world. So that the work that he began, he created a counterterrorism and intelligence bureaus with almost 1,000 officers, detectives, analysts, that were focused on coordination with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but recognizing that the feds could not protect everything everywhere, and that New York, where it is going to be such a prominent target, that was going to require that the NYPD, for the first time in its history, really devote major resources to terrorism. And many other police departments around the country had to do the same thing. When I went to LA in 2002, mirrored very much what Ray was doing in New York, in that I had, in that much smaller department, proportionally the same number of personnel that were now going to focus on terrorism, because LA was right behind New York as a major focus of terrorism. In the ensuing 16 years since 9/11, that Al-Qaeda was the principal concern. And Al-Qaeda's focus, however, was really on trying to repeat 9/11 again. They wanted to do the big thing. And they were also, at the same time, really being driven into hiding. That Osama was hiding in Pakistan. They were communicating literally by hand-passed notes, because they were not able to basically operate within the new computer world without being detected. But starting in 2013, ISIS split off and took advantage of the Syrian civil war, began to do something that Al-Qaeda thought was going to take 100 years, and establish a caliphate. And in that caliphate, we were able to attract 30,000 to 40,000 people from all over the world, who they inspired through the 21st century technology of social media. They could reach out and recruit through Twitter and Facebook and bring these young people to the fight, or increasingly, which they're now doing in even more increasing fashion, inspire through their websites, through their magazines, enable, teach people, think of the brothers in Boston, the marathon, how to make a bomb and how to use it, or direct, think of Paris in terms of the multiple attacks that occurred there. So ISIS really pushed Al-Qaeda off to the side. Al-Qaeda was working desperately to get back in the game, again with some success. But ISIS came into being just as I came back into policing in 2014 in New York. So NYPD, as well positioned as it had been to fight Al-Qaeda, was not as well positioned to fight the ISIS threat, the lone wolf that you referenced. The idea of if you have a knife, use a knife. If you have a gun, use a gun. If you have a hatchet, use a hatchet. As one of them did in 2014, 4 of my young cops just out of the academy, standing on a corner. They just posed for a photograph with a tourist. And this madman comes out of nowhere with a hatchet, hits one of them in the head with it, hits another one, and then is shot and killed. He was inspired by ISIS when we did the follow-up investigation. Initially, U.S. government refused to classify that as a terrorist attack, interestingly enough. This was the first time it happened. And the idea that it was inspired that rather than enabled or directed. So we saw an increasing capability of ISIS to do just that. And so to help protect the city, we created 2 new units who were very much in evidence yesterday during the attack in New York. A 600-person counterterrorism force to support the 1,000 detectives and analysts that Ray had created. But these were uniformed officers, long guns, helmets, heavy-duty vests, special vehicles, special constant training. These are the people that we use to protect the embassies, to protect critical sites, who are constantly being briefed on what the threats of the moment are anywhere in the world. We also, as a result of the demonstrations that were going on, the post-Ferguson demonstrations, the Ghana, my 2 officers being assassinated in their police car just 5 days before Christmas in 2014. In response to those demonstrations, we were not prepared to deal with them. Why? Because the demonstrators, like ISIS, were now using social media to gather people very quickly, put out a tweet, we're going to meet in this corner. They could get 50, 100, 200 people like that. And then instead of being stationary, off they went. And so the idea was dealing with demonstrations was going to be very different in this 21st century. So we created an 800-person strategic response group, similarly equipped as the counterterrorism personnel were, but bicycles in their vehicles, riot shields to deal with demonstrations if they got out of hand. And so the mayor authorized 1,300 additional police officers to staff up these units. And we spent hundreds of millions of dollars equipping them with the latest technology, training, and equipment for the 21st century ISIS threat. And time and again, that they have been able to literally flood the zone, if you will. And you saw that yesterday, a lot of the commentator remarks about how quickly police responded to that mile-long crime scene. Hundreds of officers there within 5 minutes, including the 4 officers who encountered the gunman literally within a minute of his exiting his vehicle. So the world of policing changed so dramatically in the 21st century. And New York, my pride in that department, I think, is quite evident, as it was in LAPD and Boston. But New York this year, when it reports its crime statistics, there's going to be a new focus on that city. Because what they've been able to do in that department is they are literally a 21st century police department. They have learned how to deal with crime successfully. It will not go back up in New York again. Might spike here or there, but it's not going to go up. Disorder is going to be kept under control and in a way that's causing less confrontation with minority groups. But terrorism, cybercrime, emotionally disturbed, the opioid crises, which is taking 65,000 lives. The strength of American policing is that the ideas to deal with these societal issues, so many of them come from the ranks of American policing. And I'm an optimist by nature and have always been. And I'm optimistic about a profession that for so long was very cynical, very pessimistic. But I think it's an organization, a profession now that feels and understands its importance, particularly in this 21st century.
Turn to another subject. Obviously, when your story is written, CompStat will be a big part of that story. Another one of those historic initiatives that you helped lead and brought into the New York City Police Department. I understand, though, through a little research, it came from something that you referred to at the New York City Transit Police as charts of the future. An innovator named Jack Maple, one of your officers, actually created that theory and that analytical tool. Tell us about charts of the future and how it evolved into CompStat, and how important is CompStat today, and how has it changed?
I think my most significant legacy in policing, and it's not just mine, it's the work of many minds, and over a period of time, is what has now been commonly called CompStat. And I'll explain that in a moment, its elements, and try to explain it in a way that it resonates with everybody in this audience, no matter what your background. The actual origin of it, however, was back in 1975, 76. Chuck Wexler's in the audience here. Chuck's the executive director of Police Executive Research Forum. Chuck and I shared a desk in the police commissioner's office in 75. He was on one side, I was on the other. I was a new sergeant. Chuck was a student intern, and back in those days, and the profound impact that he and Perf have had on the profession. But I was assigned to a new program in the Police District 4 of Boston, the South End, Back Bay, Fenway area. And in dealing with the crime situation down there, my role was to go out and organize community meetings so people come in and talk to the police for the first time about what was on their mind about crime in their neighborhoods. And I was armed to the teeth with these computer printouts, those big green things about 3 feet wide. I was a real whiz at putting those together, and went in with all my crime stats about major crime in the worst crime areas of that police district. And night after night, people didn't want to talk about the major crime. They were concerned about it, but most of them had not been actual victims. And there was so much of it, the newspapers weren't reporting a lot of it, so they were really not even aware of a lot of what was going on in their neighborhoods. They went to work in the morning, come home at night, locked themselves inside, and really didn't have a sense of it. But what they were aware of, and this was my awakening, this was my eureka moment, they wanted to talk about the prostitute who was using their doorway, the gang on the corner that was keeping them awake at night, the abandoned car that the city never seemed to tow and just kept getting destroyed, broken windows, George Kelly, the graffiti that seemed to be everywhere. They wanted to talk about this so-called victimless crimes. And that was amazing to me. We've got murders, we have robberies, we have break-ins, and you want to talk about this. But that's what they saw every day. And what we were missing in policing in the 70s and 80s, we were told to focus on serious crime, responding to serious crime, while society figured out what to do about it. Because we thought the causes of it were poverty, unemployment, racism, demographics, a lot of young people, even the weather. And police couldn't do anything about those. Society was going to have to figure it out. So police should move away from focus on the prevention of crime and disorder and focus on serious crime, which was growing astronomically in that era. Major mistake, and that was a major flaw in the Kerner report, because the Kerner report effectively said, don't pay attention to those minor crimes in those neighborhoods, particularly in the minority neighborhoods, because it was just basically causing aggravation in those communities. What it didn't recognize that by treating the minority communities different than other neighborhoods, by tolerating these so-called victimless crimes, they might have been victimless, but what the victim was the neighborhood itself. And so I began tracking the crime in my office. I had maps all over. And I had a clerk at night that would take the crime reports and the reports I was getting from the community meetings, and we put little stick-em pins on those maps. And very quickly, hotspots began developing, clusters. And I would sit on a Sunday morning in my office, and I would do up 21 directed patrol forms to tell my officers, I want you at this location on that hotspot at this time of day, every day. And so effectively, my appreciation of data and the importance of data began in 1975. So when I met Jack Maple in the transit police 20 years later, the reason he resonated so well with me was he got it. He got the importance of tracking crime for the purpose of preventing it. Spot when you had a trend developing when there were 4 or 5 and get in there and try to stop it rather than waiting till there were 20 or 30. And so that was the origin of CompStat in the sense of in my career. And then marrying up with Jack Maple when I went to the NYPD and Louis Anamone, Chief of Patrol, and many others, CompStat was created. And let me explain it briefly. CompStat has 4 elements to it. Makes a lot of sense today, but 20 years ago, most people didn't quite appreciate it. It's timely, accurate intelligence. Gather your crime stats every day. Rapid response. Identify a pattern when it's 2 or 3 or 4 or a cluster. Rapidly respond to it. Put cops on the dots. Effective tactics. What's going to work? Uniform, plain clothes, task force, coordination with the feds, coordination with the prosecutors, community policing. Partnership. Listen to the community. What are their priorities? Partnership with the rest of the criminal justice system. For what purpose? Focus on the problems that you're identifying on your own as a police agency, the community. And lastly, prevention. The basic mission for which the police exist is the prevention of crime, not the response to it. And that was the sea change that CompStat brought about. And that sea change, however, was first referenced by Sir Robert Peel in 1829. Its first principle, the basic mission for which the police exist, is the prevention of crime and disorder. He understood the link. Don't deal with disorder, and like a weed in the garden, it's going to grow and become more serious and more serious crime. 70s and 80s, American policing moved away from dealing with disorder, focused on serious crime, wasn't focused on preventing it, was focused on responding to it. 911, clearance rates, major mistakes. In the 90s, in the NYPD, we had the opportunity to take all these ideas that had grown in the 70s and 80s, and CompStat was created. Timely, accurate intelligence with the maps, rapid response, cops on the dots, effective tactics. In the CompStat session, they exchanged information, what's working, what's not working, and then relentless follow-up. You're coming back 2 weeks later to CompStat again as a precinct commander, you better have an answer to what's going on with that pattern that's been growing in your precinct. Not enough resources, but we dealt with it. And the sharing, the inclusion aspect of it. Now let me close with this in the sense of a medical analogy, something we're all concerned with in our life. I have in the back of my head that this bandage that I'm wearing, that's CompStat. Timely, accurate intelligence that I go every year for skin examination. Irish fair skin. California, when I was there, I used to go twice a year. Well, when about 2 weeks ago, timely, accurate intelligence takes a look at me. Uh-oh, you've got a basal cell in the back of your head, much more significant than just a early skin cancer. Rapid response schedules me to go in, see a surgeon. Third, effective tactics. Surgeon takes it out. Left a hell of a lot of scars in the back of my head for the moment. And relentless follow-up. He'll want to see me next Thursday, then he's going to want to see me 3 months and then 6 months out to make sure that he got it all. That's CompStat. CompStat is the same that a doctor does. And think of what does a doctor do? A doctor's role is to do you no harm while he tries to cure you or prevent illness. What do we do in policing? As we're policing to try to do as little harm as possible while we're trying to cure you. So I oftentimes will use medical comparisons because the two equate so perfectly. CompStat is nothing more than what the medical profession was always doing. It took us in policing a couple of 100 years to get around to it.
Another,
There'll be a test before you leave, so remember those 4 elements.
it's a huge part of law enforcement today. Stop, question, and frisk. You alluded to it earlier. It's been somewhat controversial. There were a lot more of those encounters, interactions with the public in New York City before you took your second term as commissioner. You significantly reduced those stops, those questions, those frisks under your tenure, and yet crime continued to spiral downward significantly. What is your opinion right now of stop, question, and frisk, and why did you reduce it so significantly?
Stop, question, and frisk is the essential tool of American policing. It is the foundation of everything we do. In New York, it's been misreported that it's been done away with. Many other police departments around the country have tried to change the terminology because in this heated racial climate, stop, question, and frisk has been seen as some type of racial tool by the police to impact negatively on minority communities, particularly minority young men. And unfortunately, it was used that way in New York City. There's now a consent decree by a federal judge that found the practice to be racist in nature. I don't believe that, but in this, the extent of damage it was doing to the minority community, it had that element to it. Stop, question, and frisk. Terry versus Ohio, 1968. I go to the police academy in 1970. One of the first things we're taught, that with reasonable suspicion that a crime is, or is about to be committed, a police officer can stop and question an individual as to, what are you up to? And if that officer feels for his safety or the immediate public, he can pat or frisk the person, a pat down. That's stop, question, frisk. Somehow or another, we've lost question, and it's just now stop and frisk. In New York City, my predecessor was using it as a tool as I used it in the 1990s. It had not been used significantly in the 70s or 80s. In the 90s, to get control of crime in New York and disorder, we began to ramp up our enforcement, including stop, question, and frisk where appropriate with reasonable suspicion. The numbers began to grow, arrests went up, jail population went up, but it's like a doctor treating you for cancer. He may have to hit you with radiation, chemo, surgery to get control of it, but then after he has control of it, like a bell curve, it will go down. And my prediction in '96 was that it would go down. So Rikers Island Prison, 22,000 inmates in '96. Today it has 9,000. It has fewer prisoners than it has guards. So the prediction of the prison population going down as crime went down, with an 80% decline in crime, you would think there'd be fewer people to arrest than there are. This year, New York City will have 1 million fewer enforcement encounters with the population of New York, and crime keeps going down. 2010, 700,000 documented stop, question, and some frisk in New York City. The minority community, the patient, was saying, crime is down so dramatically, why every year are you giving me more medicine? Why every year are more young minority males, in particular, being stopped? And inappropriately stopped by many young police officers who are not properly trained or supervised, but who are encouraged to be very proactive. Well, in a much safer city, there was less to be proactive about. And what started happening? Reasonable suspicion started getting less and less. So it was my belief, and I hold this strong belief, that it was being inappropriately applied. So the mayor that appointed me in 2013-14 campaigned that he believed, based on my advice, that it could be reduced, but crime could still be reduced. And we've been proven correct. This year, New York City will have the safest crime year in its history. Murders down another 25%, shooting victims down another 25%. And this year, the department will do 12,000 documented stop, question, and frisk. 700,000, 12,000. That means, basically, 700,000 fewer young Black and Latino males being stopped by the police. Much less medicine for a much healthier patient. And if you want to improve race relations, don't basically be giving too much medicine when it's not appropriate. If you look at Ferguson, what was going on in Ferguson? To fund the police department and the rest of city government, they were applying phenomenal amounts of medicine in terms of traffic enforcement and other tools in that city to generate revenue. Police should never be used to generate revenue, because what it leads to is Ferguson.
We've been hearing a lot about the crime problem, crisis really, in Chicago, all right? A couple numbers I'll share with you. 335 homicides last year in New York City. In Chicago, there were 762, more than double. Last year in New York City, there were 998 shootings, which was the first time in modern history, I believe, that it's been below 1,000. In Chicago, there were 4,300 shootings. last year. Hypothetical, Bill Bratton is called upon to become superintendent of police in Chicago. What would be some of the measures you would implement to try to deal with that crisis? What's going on in Chicago that's not happening in New York?
Well, put it in proportion. New York has almost 4 times the population of Chicago. So those numbers are even starker when you look at the number of crimes per 100,000. Each city, and I think I have a lot of experience to be able to make this statement, is like a doctor dealing with patients. No two are alike. New York is very different than LA. Both are very different than Boston. Chicago, a city I have a lot of familiarity with and love, I think it's America's most beautiful city, is also a very different patient. And so to police effectively, a police chief, a police leader has to, first of all, be a very successful physician. Physician that is good at diagnosing the illness. Very significant is knowing how much medicine to apply, not 700,000 stops, but maybe 12,000, and how to work with the patient to effectively get the patient to work with you, to explain why am I feeling ill, what do I think I'm going to need to help me feel better. It's not just the doctor diagnosing, it's working together. And isn't that community policing? So once again, the medical. Chicago's issue at this time are multiple. It has, because of the whole historical trend of over-incarceration in the 90s of young minorities, that there's a real aversion to putting young minorities back into jail. Understandable, but unfortunately, some have to go to jail because they're killers, they're murderers, they're sociopaths, whether they're white, black, or Latino, they need to go to jail. But there's a great reluctance in Chicago to put people in jail. That's part of it. There is also a police force, a large part of the police force that has effectively stopped proactive policing, that will chase the 911 calls, but for a variety of reasons has effectively stopped proactive policing. I had that issue when I went to LA in 2002. That police department had stopped the most proactive, assertive police department in America for 50 years, had stopped. And effectively, the expression was drive by and wave, that they would literally drive by and wave rather than stopping if they saw something. Multiple issues in Chicago. There is no quick fix. There are political issues, there are resource issues, there are morale issues, leadership issues. Can it be fixed? Yes. A lot of effort underway at the moment, a lot of chefs in the kitchen, if you will, a lot of close friends of mine. Some progress being made. That's the good news, that the spiking is seeming to start trending the other way. But again, there is no quick fix. And again, that comparing one city to another, which we do in policing, you really can't do it because every city is so different. The luxury I had in New York these last 3 years is I had, for the first time in my 50-year career, unlimited resources. I was able to convince the mayor to hire more cops after the city had lost 6,000 cops in the previous 12 years. Something not known in New York was after 9/11, they began shrinking the police force by 6,000 officers over that 12-year period of time in the midst of the growing problems of terrorism, the cybercrime, and now the opioid crisis. So we started hiring again, but we had money for training and equipment and resources. It's like a doctor. He might be able to diagnose your problem, but if you can't afford the prescriptions that he's prescribing, you're not going to get better. And right now in American policing, in America in general, we are not spending enough on this issue because we have the ideas, we have the prescriptions, we have the doctors that know how to mix those prescriptions, but what is missing is medicine on the shelf, resources, research, and that problem is not getting better. It's actually getting worse in terms of the resourcing of American policing.
I'm going to go to the audience in just a moment. If you have a question and you're near the ends of your aisle, we have microphones. If you want to raise your hand, we'll get to you. And as you prepare for that and give some thought to your own questions, one last one from me at this point. Commissioner, I wanted to read this quote from you. It was in an op-ed to the Washington Post. Police can be abrupt, sometimes rude with the people we encounter, and that leaves a lasting impression, particularly in our most vulnerable communities. To rebuild trust, a little graciousness can go a long way. When officers grant people their humanity, most return the favor. Elaborate on that if you would.
Elaborate on that. That's, I forget making that statement.
Beautiful statement. Thank you.
We're very fortunate that we live in the most successful democracy that has ever been. And in that democracy, we have a Constitution, Bill of Rights, where the number one obligation of government in our democracy is public safety. And that obligation, the principal entity that is required to fulfill it are the police. The police are given awesome powers, more so than just about any other entity in our government. But to police effectively, you have to do several things. You cannot break the law to enforce the law. You have to, I describe it as the 3 C's. You have to police compassionately. You're dealing with human beings, even though some of them are terrible, terrible people. You have to police consistently. You can't police differently in a poor neighborhood, rich neighborhood, white neighborhood, black neighborhood. The consistency of policing, the treatment, if you will. And then you certainly have to police the idea of constitutionally, that within the law. And so that issue, I believe, if you do that, even though a lot of what police exists for is to control behavior to such an extent that we change it when necessary. And by that I mean, in New York City in the 1990s, after 25 years of total neglect for dealing with quality of life offenses in the streets, public urination, gaming, prostitution, 8,000 open-air drug locations, 250,000 people a day not paying the fare to get into the subway. It was a city that was out of control. And who was responsible for regaining control? The police. And so to regain control for a period of time, we had to apply a lot of medicine. But it was the idea, like a doctor, once he gets it under control, you reduce the medicine. So there was that bell curve. And if you do it the right way, that you're able to effectively not have so much of what we're dealing with now in terms of the racial tension, where it's felt that we weren't doing it the right way, that we were doing it not within the law, but outside the law, or that we weren't doing it compassionately, or that we were doing it differently in a black neighborhood from a white neighborhood. I'm an optimist about this profession that I love, that I was part of for 50 years, that I'm still part of in the sense of being aware of what it's up to and commenting on it. Despite the troubles that we're dealing with in America today, in the world today, I am optimistic because I remember where we were in 1970, and I see where we are, particularly in New York City. New York City is the future of the world. That's what the world's going to look like in the next 50 years. The city where 40% are foreign born. At this particular time, almost 70% were not born there. It is a city that works every day, the most racially, most internationally mixed city in America. And on that subway system, with 6 million riders a day, some days there's 6 reported crimes a day in those jammed cars. And that jammed city of 8.5 million people, lowest crime rate of any major city in America, lowest crime rate of any major city in many countries in the world, including now London. So I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist, that we have challenges, but American policing, I think, has met those challenges better than many other entities in America today. So that was kind of the foundation of that you can have effective policing, you can have just policing, you can have satisfactory policing, not only for the public, but for the cops also.
The message is this, that only 1 out of 5 Americans has any interaction with an officer during the course of a year. Most people may go their entire lifetime without ever interacting with a police officer. So that one encounter that officer has with that individual, whether it's a traffic violation or a call for service, you name it, that may be their only impression they'll ever have of a law enforcement officer. So let's make it a positive one. I think that's what I read into that statement, and I love it.
As a young kid growing up in Boston wanting to be a cop, my gang that stood on the corner of Heckler and Adams Street, 3 blocks from the police station, in all the years we stood there, no cop ever going by ever kicked us off the corner. We were that good, if you will. And the only encounter I had with a police officer in that growing up period of time was officer friendly. He'd come to school, give the safety lectures. I'd go down to the library and check out my books and watch the cops march out 2 by 2, get in the back of the paddy wagon and be delivered to their posts. So I was always watching them from a distance, but didn't know a cop, nobody in the family, never had a word with a cop, except back in the old days, and the cops used to come around and do the census. So they come in and sit at the kitchen table for a couple of minutes and make out the census form. And I used to just sit there in awe that this cop there with his census form and take off his blouse and sit and have a cup of coffee, and that was it. The one experience I actually had with police, my dad was taking me for a driving lesson on a Sunday morning, quiet, no traffic. We're at Codman Square. We stop behind a police car at a red light, and the light turns green. And the 2 cops are busy shooting the breeze, not paying attention. And I'm sitting there, and I'm afraid to do anything. And my dad says, "Blow the horn." And I said, "Dad, they're cops." Dad said, "Blow the horn. The light's green." My dad was, he didn't like abuse of authority. I don't like abuse of authority, but I think I get it from him. So what do? I toot the horn. And naturally, police car pulls over. We pull around. They pull behind us. Light goes on. Siren goes on. Pull us over. And one of the officers gets out. That not particular good safety procedure. The other guy was busy reading the paper in the back of the car. And the one comes up, and he's got a butt hanging out of his mouth. And he comes up beside me and kind of leans in the window. Excuse the expression. "Who the F do you think you are?" That was my first encounter with a Boston police officer.
Oh, jeez.
"Who the F do you think you are?" I had the great satisfaction of, in the mid-1970s, of meeting that officer again. First as a sergeant, his sergeant, first as a lieutenant, and then in 1980 as his superintendent. And every time I saw him, I reminded him of our first encounter.
That's a great story.
Here it is, 50-some-odd years later, 55 years later, and I still remember that encounter.
Yeah.
So encounters with police matter. They really do.
That's a great story. Do we have a hand here? Right here, Alyssa?
You spoke about some of the traditional issues that police have faced in terms of prevention and disorder, crime. But now you're in a new environment of cybersecurity, the implications of social media, terrorism, et cetera. What are some of the qualities that are important in terms of leadership in the law enforcement environment?
It's an easy one. It's leadership is about, first off, optimism. The idea that if you're not optimistic, you're not going to be able to. Optimism basically tinged with realism. That I've just talked about American policing at the moment, my optimism about the ideas, and we know how to do this, but the realism that many police departments don't have the budgets, the resources, that if they had, they could be so much better than they are. But it starts with optimism, and I've been all my life, I drive my wife crazy. Somebody gets up in the morning and just, what a great day. And she says, we should shut the hell up, that in terms of just goes back to sleep. But that's how I am. And also the idea of the expression that never let them see you sweat, that my style of leadership is the idea that your role is in crises, and there's always going to be crises. And I'm also somebody who believes if you don't have one, create one, because I also believe crises is opportunity, crises is challenge, crises is the opportunity to basically accelerate change for something that you want to change, good or bad. But the idea of don't let them see you sweat, that I tend to calm down the more significant the crises. My heartbeat actually goes down. And Al O'Leary, my press person in the transit police, used to talk about, and he always marveled at this, I didn't kill the messenger. There was always a lot of bad news coming in. And, you know, somebody come running in, Chief, the sky is falling. And I said, oh. And get up, and I'd walk out of the room, go out to the outer office, get a cup of coffee, and come back and sit down. And Al said you could tell how serious the crisis was by how long it took me to go get the cup of coffee. More serious, the more time I needed to think about it, and I'd sit down and say, okay, how are we going to address this? So the idea of, as a leader, to convey confidence, to convey enthusiasm, to be inclusive. I'm a very inclusive leader in that I'd rather have people in the tent than outside the tent. And that's what CompStat is all about, if you think about it. CompStat is about having all the leadership of the department, the 3 stars and the 4 stars and the commissioner, but in that room also a lot of detectives and police officers from the precinct. In that room, and what are we talking about? In 1994, we were talking about crime, and we were talking about disorder. Now in the 21st century, we're talking about cyber, we're talking about terrorism. But it's the idea of inclusiveness, you know, that the idea from that guy at the back of the room who's afraid to raise his hand, that the encouragement that you have the opportunity to be part of it. So leadership is essential, and the good news is that American police leadership is much more progressive than it's given credit for. I've had the privilege of working with some extraordinary men and women over these last number of years. Chuck Wexler, if he's still here, their Senior Management Institute has produced some of the best police leaders in America. Over 6,000 members of American police middle management have gone through a program that I teach at every year because I love it so much. Because I went to it in 1980. I was a member of the 2nd class of it, the Senior Management Institute for Police. And I learned so much from the 60 colleagues from around the country who were sharing their ideas. So it's the idea of creating opportunity to allow people to be heard, to share ideas. And so that's my idea of leadership. I really think of myself as a transformational leader. I don't want to go into something that's working well. I want to go into an organization in crisis. I don't want to come in behind a superstar. And your question in terms of why did I leave after 3 years, I stayed 7 years in LA because it took that long to fix that department. But if it took 3 years, I would have been gone. I'm too restless. I don't like just running the same thing day after day. I like turning the flywheel and getting it going. And then when it starts spinning, time to move on.
Here.
Commissioner, thank you for being here. I think we have a pretty good cross-section of audience here. And I've had the pleasure of working with Lieutenant Vince Amadeo of the NYPD SHIELD program. Vince and his staff are fantastic. But could you address the recognition that NYPD had of having an aggressive public-private partnership?
The incident that we all saw yesterday, that unfortunate incident, the first loss of life since 9/11 from a terrorist act, that my predecessor, Ray Kelly, had already referenced the phenomenal job that he did in the crises immediately after 9/11. One of the things that he created was the essence of community policing, that partnership between the police and the private sector, particularly the security component of the private sector. An operation called Operation SHIELD. 3,000 to 4,000 security directors from the tri-state region, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, which are pretty much all joined at the hip up there. And the idea was that they would be additional eyes and ears. There's 800,000 cops in America, 2.5 million private security officers, and in the federal government, I think, effectively about, well, now with Customs and Border Patrol increasing, but there's still probably fewer than 100,000 actual law enforcement personnel at the federal level. So we need all those eyes and ears in the private sector. And the SHIELD component is the idea of we can connect with you through emails very quickly, through notifications, to let you know what's going on. We're looking for somebody, we need help, or for you to have conduits of communication directly into the appropriate areas in the department, terrorism units, intelligence units. So your question really speaks to the essentiality of policing in the 21st century, the idea of partnership. I worked very hard my 3 years as commissioner to ensure that there was no daylight between us and any other police organization or federal agency. And I would defy you to find any agency or police organization that works with the NYPD that says that the NYPD doesn't collaborate and cooperate with them openly. There's no room for any daylight in dealing with terrorism or dealing with traditional crime. So that involvement of the private sector, which for so many years was looked down upon, that, oh, you know, the old security guard, et cetera. No, in an era of see something, say something, they're as important as anybody else in the equation.
If 1 in 5 Americans, or 1 in 5 Americans have an interaction with the police department, they don't really know, Americans don't know the police. So to what degree is the American broadcast media impacting or creating or maintaining the divide between African American communities and the police?
That's a great question. The impact of the media can never be underestimated, both the good and the bad. On the bad side, the expression, if it bleeds, it leads, traditional news media has oftentimes basically portrayed the violence, portrayed the issues of, if they have the video to go with it, increasingly that they have more video than they had to work with, that oftentimes police interactions with members of the community, whether white or black, but the idea that so much of what policing does looks awful, but is lawful. There is no use of force by the police that looks good. Even if we as police professionals look at it and say, that's exactly how we trained our personnel to respond. It just looks awful. And particularly in the context of a 30-second snippet on the start of the evening news. The good news is that this issue of body cameras, the issue of every one of you has a smartphone that you can take a picture or a video, I actually think that's a great thing. Because I think that over time, that one will recognize that the events that oftentimes look awful and are awful are relatively few in the overall context of the millions of interactions. They're still awful, still look awful, and may in fact help us to weed out of policing those awful police officers who shouldn't be there in the first place. But I also think that just the sheer idea that 300 million Americans can photograph or videotape a police officer behaving inappropriately, and when we see that there are relatively few of those incidents, despite those organizations that encourage it, encourage people to go out and photograph the police, I think that's a good thing. I also think that the body cameras that police will be wearing will be beneficial to them and to the public over time. And I think that we're already seeing some clear evidence of that as more and more of those are coming into use. But the major change in policing that I think is very beneficial to police in terms of trying to heal the racial divide is the 21st century that we live in, social media. That police, for most of their history, were totally dependent on the media, radio, newspapers, television, to tell their story. And with limited airtime, the stories that were told were oftentimes of the abuse, the neglect, the brutality, the corruption, the racism, and occasionally the good news story. Policing now has, in this generation that we live in, an incredible opportunity through social media to effectively tell the story. So, for example, in 2014, when I went into the NYPD, they had none of the social media. They had a 50-person office that dealt with TV, newspapers, and radio. I now have, or my successor now has, a 65-person social media unit that does Twitter, does the blog, does the Facebook. If it's out there in a way of communicating both to the cops internally and to the public, we're doing it. My Twitter site had 50,000 followers. We could put out a message in the NYPD, and within 24 hours it would reach 1 million people. That's better than the circulation of any of the newspapers in New York that at that time. So there's an opportunity to tell a story in a different way. And for the community to interact with the cops, the idea of, in terms of being able to interact with the police department through the Twitter, through the Facebook, through the smartphones that every one of the 36,000 New Yorks carry. So that while social media was certainly fundamental in helping ICES get as influential as it is, on the plus side, I think it's going to also really go a long way toward reducing some of the tensions between the police and public over time. Not now, not tomorrow, but over time.
You had mentioned that one of the issues facing law enforcement today and communities around the country is the opioid crisis, which seems to rival the crack cocaine crisis of the 80s and early 90s. General consensus seems to suggest that this is a crisis that has to be handled as more than just a criminal matter. So I wanted to ask what you think law enforcement can do and the role that law enforcement can play in helping to combat the opioid epidemic that's seems to be ravaging the country right now.
Interestingly enough, law enforcement is, and this is reflective of the change in the progressive thinking of the leadership of law enforcement. This was an issue that was highlighted primarily by law enforcement chiefs up in Massachusetts, some other states that were experiencing this new problem of addiction, particularly early on when the crisis first began a number of years ago, the oversubscribing of pain-killing drugs. And the issue, however, has now morphed that there's actually 3 crises under the umbrella of the opioid crises. The pharmaceutical crisis, which was probably the accelerant that began the problem, has been reduced significantly as a result of some of the enforcement actions that have been brought in against pharmacies, how much they can prescribe, doctors, how many they can prescribe. So that the current problem in terms of overdose deaths, about 13% of those deaths can be attributed back to the dependence on opioid prescriptive drugs as the catalyst or the genesis of that person's problem. What happened, however, the unintended consequence of beginning to try to deal with that growing problem of addiction to prescription drugs, as the controls began on reducing its availability, the cartels in Mexico seized the moment to start pushing into the country huge amounts of heroin, purposely sold it very cheaply. And the heroin of the 21st century is very different in the potency of the heroin of the 60s and 70s when I first came in. Incredibly powerful. It's now been compounded by a third component, fentanyl, manufactured in China, made up of every concoction of crazy drug you can think of. So you never know what you're getting when you get a batch of it. So the heroin is being laced with the fentanyl. Or as we called it, K2, we had a K2 crisis in New York. They were taking effectively, called it synthetic marijuana, because they were basically using sort of a tea-like substance and spraying fentanyl on it. It was being smoked. And the reaction of people, some of them went totally crazy. It was because you never knew what was in it. So when you think of the opioid crises, there's 3 of them. The good news is the pill one is starting to come under control. The bad news one is that the heroin issue, the Mexican cartels are really still pushing that. And then thirdly, that the fentanyl is still a major problem coming out of China. It can be ordered through the mails. Hopefully when President Trump goes over there, he raises that issue with them to see if they can tighten up on the production of it. That crisis is worse than the crack cocaine crisis, worse than the HIV crisis. 65,000 deaths this year. Next year, probably about 75,000. The good news is, however, American policing is approaching this differently than they did crack. You cannot arrest your way out of the problem. We learned that. So we understand now that our role is really trying to deal with the input, the heroin, the fentanyl, dealing with the bad doctors, but at the same time dealing with the addict, not necessarily as the criminal in most instances, but as basically a person to be aided. So increasingly, New York City was one of the first to start using the nose spray issue to try and rescue those that were overdosing. unfortunately, some of the drugs they're consuming are so powerful, it can take 3 or 4 doses to try and bring somebody back. We started with 1, and we had to raise it to 2 for every one of our officers carries it. But now you have to carry 3 or 4 because the doses are so powerful with the fentanyl aspect of it. So we are still on the hockey stick increase of that problem. And we are nowhere close to effectively conquering it. But policing this time is approaching it very differently. It is approaching it not as something that we can just lock them up as we did in the 90s. We're approaching it in a very different way, and appropriately so.
Fortunately, we're running out of time. I know we could ask many more questions and sit here for hours. I would like to end it with this, though, Commissioner. You have been such a huge supporter of the National Law Enforcement Museum effort. Your wife, Ricky, especially supportive as well.
Cynthia Brown.
And Cynthia Brown, certainly a mutual friend of ours and a great supporter, the publisher, editor of American Police Beat. So I know in your past, in LA, in Boston, and New York, you've emphasized the importance of officers knowing the history of their department. And obviously this museum will speak a lot to the public and hopefully be a bridge to help strengthen that partnership between the public and police. But why is it so important, do you think, for the law enforcement profession to have their story told and to know their history?
I look at myself that I love the history of policing, but it's something that's not taught in police academies. You almost have to be self-taught. You have to seek it out. Some colleges have law enforcement courses, but they're few and far between. I was very fortunate that as a young boy, I just loved the idea of cops and used to check a book out called Your Police, a caricature book of the NYPD. And that was the inspiration to start looking at the NYPD. So what you are doing, Craig, with you and your colleagues and the passion that you bring to it is critically important at this time in our history to capture what went before to help shape what comes ahead. And one of my great frustrations in the NYPD, country's largest police department, doesn't have a museum. It has tremendous traditions. It has things that it celebrates, but we don't teach those cops, those young cops, the history of what they're coming into, the tradition of the organization. And at the national level, until the idea of this National Museum came along a number of years ago, there was really no place that you could find police history. The FBI next door had a museum that celebrated the FBI and in some respects showed some of the history, the arc of history of policing. But they're really, with the exception of some police museums in some cities. So I can't say enough about the effort you've been engaged in and the many pockets you've had to pick over these years to people see Craig coming now and they run the other way.
Fewer friends than I used to
Fortunately, a lot
have.
of them, like Target, that one of the principal sponsors has never run the other way. They effectively walk side by side with them. And I'm really looking forward to the opening of that museum. I'm a great admirer, for example, of the museum down in New Orleans, the celebration of World War II and all that went on in that great effort, the greatest generation. What the police museum will be celebrating will be the many great generations of policing and police officers, because any profession is only as good as the people who make it up. And fortunately, in our profession, there's many who have made great contributions but have been uncelebrated. So apart from the memorialization that the foundation has been so involved in, the memorial wall celebrating the deaths of officers in the line of duty, this will celebrate the living also. The idea, we can never forget those who gave their lives. We also have to remember those who gave their lives, their careers, to keeping this country safe. So thank you for this opportunity to be with this wonderful audience and to do it under the banner of the museum. It's one of those extraordinary things that I'm glad I'll live to actually see it.
We are extremely pleased that you would spend this evening with us. On behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you for sharing your story. We're telling the story of American law enforcement at the National Law Enforcement Museum, which will open its doors next fall. And your story, sir, will be a very important part of that overall story of American law enforcement. You played a major role. One link in the chain, a big link, if I might say so. This gentleman, I did a little research. During your second stint as Commissioner of Police in New York City, lost 6 officers in the line of duty under his watch, including perhaps the most notable deaths, the brutal assassinations of Wen Jin Liu and Rafael Ramos, not to mention the 12 officers who've died of diseases during your watch, during their recovery work at Ground Zero. That's a lot of losses, sir, and I know you've had to deal with it and had to be a leader during very difficult times. You have a great affinity for the memorial, which I thank you for, and you've certainly been a great supporter of the National Law Enforcement Museum. Thank you for sharing your story with us here
Thank all of you
tonight.
for coming this evening.
Yeah.